The Wolfman was the last of the classic Universal monsters to appear in his own film. There had been werewolf films prior to The Wolfman, which was released in 1941. There was The Werewolf of London, there was The She-Wolf of London, there were other werewolf films, even made by Universal, that came before, but the one that everybody remembers, the one starring Lon Chaney Jr., that big hulk of a man, as Lawrence Talbot, aka the Wolfman, that didn't come along until 1941. And of the films that are generally considered to be a part of the Universal horror franchise, the ones that would eventually find their characters recycled into the Monster Rally films and the Abbott and Costello films, the Wolfman was the last to be established. The Wolfman is a lesson in strong, competent, efficient horror filmmaking. There's not a wasted scene. There's not a wasted line. It is clean and efficient and just exactly as long as it needs to be. And it's a lesson in screenwriting and in directing and in editing that a lot of modern filmmakers, especially a lot of modern commercial filmmakers who make these big multi-million dollar epic blockbuster summer films, could stand to learn. The Wolfman is only a little over an hour long. And I know that that's not a realistic expectation for a big budget Hollywood film. And obviously you're going to want, the mentality is, if people are going to pay these high ticket prices to go see a movie, you've got to give them at least 2 hours or they're not going to feel like they've got their money's worth. That's fine, but the lesson isn't so much in the length, it's in the use of that running time. There's not a single thing in The Wolfman that doesn't need to be there. The Wolfman contains a lot of interesting threads that tie it, not so much directly, but nonetheless tie it very strongly to previous films in the Universal series. I'll talk about a few of those. For instance, the lead in his first starring role, and what would become his defining role for his career, Lon Chaney Jr. plays Lawrence Talbot, aka the Wolfman. Lon Chaney Jr., of course, is the son of Lon Chaney, the great man of 1,000 faces, the silent film star who played the Phantom of the Opera, who was the vampire in the lost horror film London After Midnight, from which we still have the surviving image of him with the baggy eyes and the serrated teeth and the top hat. He played the Hunchback of Notre Dame in a very celebrated version of that film. And Lon Chaney Sr. was the original choice by Todd Browning and Universal to play Dracula in Todd Browning's Dracula. And of course, Chaney eventually, unfortunately, died. He died of cancer very, very young. And he was replaced by Bela Lugosi, who went on to make his Dracula his defining role and one of the great horror performances in the history of cinema. And then we have, for the Wolfman, his son, Creighton Chaney, aka Lon Chaney Jr., stepping in and playing the Wolfman. And by this time, Chaney Jr. had also played, he had played the Frankenstein monster. He had sort of, he and Glenn Strange both sort of inherited the role of the monster from Boris Karloff after Karloff stopped playing the monster after Son of Frankenstein. And Chaney Jr. does a really good job as the Wolfman, and he's not the only thread connecting the Wolfman to other franchises. We also have Claude Rains, who plays Sir John Talbot, Lawrence Talbot's father, the father of the Wolfman. And he, of course, was so wonderful in The Invisible Man as that titular character. So we have these connections indirectly to the previous films in the Universal horror franchise. And it's appropriate because the Wolfman itself would then be the bridge to the next phase of the Universal horror franchise, because after the Wolfman, the franchise shifted from films about single characters, single monsters like the Wolfman or Frankenstein or Dracula or the Mummy, which I haven't talked about but is also an excellent series of movies in its own right. After the Wolfman, things transitioned into the team-up films, and I'll talk about those in the next review when I talk about Frankenstein meets the Wolfman. But Chaney Jr.'s Wolfman was sort of the last of the great single monster movies, the last of the great Universal horror films, and it is definitely a great one, and it has all of the hallmarks that made the really great Universal horror films so great. There's the human protagonist with an air of tragedy about him. All of the great Universal monsters have an element of tragedy about them. Dracula, Bela Lugosi's Dracula, maybe not so much, and maybe that's another reason why I feel like that film doesn't resonate nearly as strongly as the others. But with Karloff's Frankenstein monster, and even with Colin Clive's Dr. Frankenstein, both of those characters have a very strong element of tragedy to them. Claude Rains' The Invisible Man, Jack Griffin, an element of tragedy, a man whose creation has taken over and gotten the best of him, and he's lost control of his life through no fault of his own, through no willing fault of his own. And then with the Wolfman, the same thing. We have Lawrence Talbot, who in a way is the most innocent of all of them, because unlike The Invisible Man and unlike Dr. Frankenstein, Larry is just a complete victim of circumstance. He does not create the Wolfman accidentally through his own actions. He is bitten by a werewolf and becomes the Wolfman just through completely through no fault of his own. He is much closer to Karloff's Frankenstein monster than he is to Colin Clive's Dr. Frankenstein, or to Rains's Jack Griffin, in that sense, because he is completely innocent. And there's another connection I just thought of to the previous horror movie franchises that makes the Wolfman such a wonderful bridge between the early phase and the later phase of the Universal horror series, and that is the presence of Bela Lugosi. Bela Lugosi is in the Wolfman in a very, very small but incredibly important role as Bela the Gypsy, the werewolf that bites Lon Chaney's Larry Talbot character and transforms him into a werewolf. So you have, it's very much, when you look at it in the context of the whole Universal series, The Wolfman is very much a transitional film from the early single character, single monster phase of Dracula and Frankenstein to the later monster rally pictures. I joke with my wife when we watch The Wolfman, because like The Invisible Man, it's one of our very favorite films to watch together, and it's one that we watch together unfailingly every Halloween. And we always joke about how huge Lon Chaney Jr. is, especially compared to Claude Rains, who is supposedly his father. And we say, God, his mother must have been like 8 feet tall, because he's literally like, he's up here and here's Claude Rains down here talking to him like, son, I mean, it's ridiculous. The size disparity is just ridiculous. But yeah, so we have all these elements that make it a lot of fun, that make it really interesting, and really strong performances all around. And lots of interesting connections to the Universal films that would come before and would come after. And in the center is just a really, really great horror movie, judged purely on its own merits. Just a story about a guy who just has a tragic fate. He seems like a nice guy. He seems like a well-meaning guy. Bit of a creep when it comes to flirting with girls, but he has such an innocence and such a sort of aw shucks oafishness about him that he doesn't come across as a bad guy because of that. He just seems to have kind of an innocence about him. And then this horrible thing happens to him and changes him into a werewolf, and his life is pretty much shit after that. Other than the performances and the script by Siodmak and the very tight, very well done direction by George Wagner, who also is a producer on the film, the one thing to note above all the other aspects of The Wolfman is, of course, the makeup job on Chaney Jr. by Jack Pierce to transform him into the Wolfman. The furry face with the snout, the hairy hands, the feet that are, of course, covered in fur, and also are placed in a kind of orthopedic boot that keeps him up on his toes. So he appears to be padding through the forest on his toes like a wolf with the elevated ankle. And really well done all around. The transformation sequences, again, would be something that would be imitated in later films, focusing on a particular body part and doing slow lap dissolves to show them getting hairier and hairier. Really well done. Later on in the series, they would get confident enough and good enough at it that they could do that lap dissolve on his face and show his face turning into the Wolfman. But in this first film, their first go at it, they weren't quite feeling as confident, I guess, so they focused on his feet, and you see his feet gradually growing hairier and hairier through a series of lap dissolves. Just really, really well done, and makeup that is just iconic, almost as iconic as the Karloff Frankenstein makeup. So The Wolfman, again, comes very highly recommended for me. A great film in its own right, a great sort of summation, sort of a capstone to the first phase of the Universal horror films, and, as it turns out, a great bridge to the next phase, the latter phase of the Universal horror franchise, where eventually the quality went downhill, but not at first, because the next film after The Wolfman was Frankenstein Meets the Wolfman, and I'm going to talk about that film in the next video in this series. And as you'll see, I think that is a pretty goddamn good movie too.